China's debt trap diplomacy, the truth behind the Belt and Road. Picture this. A small country desperately needs a new port. China offers to build it. No strings attached, they say. A few years later, that country can't repay the loan. China takes control of the port for 99 years. This isn't fiction. This happened in Sri Lanka in 2017. Welcome to what critics call debt trap diplomacy, China's controversial strategy of lending massive amounts of money to developing nations, then seizing strategic assets when they can't pay back. But here's the question that nobody seems to ask. Is this really a devious trap? Or is the West simply panicking because China is playing the same game they played for centuries? Today we're diving deep into the Belt and Road Initiative, examining the real stories behind the headlines, and uncovering what's actually happening when China lends money to the world. Because the truth? It's far more complicated and more interesting than either side wants you to believe. First, let's understand what we're dealing with. In 2013, Chinese President Xi Jinping announced the Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI. The pitch was simple. China would invest trillions of dollars in infrastructure projects across Asia, Africa, Europe, and Latin America. Roads, railways, ports, power plants, the works. The scale is mind-boggling. Over 150 countries have signed cooperation agreements. More than $1 trillion invested so far. Projects spanning from Pakistan to Peru, Kenya to Kazakhstan. China frames this as win-win cooperation. They get trading partners and geopolitical influence, while developing nations get desperately needed infrastructure. Here's how a typical BRI project works. Step 1. China identifies a country needing infrastructure. Step 2. Chinese state-owned banks offer loans at commercial rates, typically 2 to 6%. Step 3. Chinese companies build the project using mostly Chinese workers. Step 4. The host country repays the loan over 15 to 30 years. Step 5. If they can't repay, well, that's where things get interesting. The West looks at this and sees a trap. China looks at it and sees business. The developing countries caught in between, they're seeing something else entirely. Let's start with the most famous case, Hambantota port in Sri Lanka. The Western narrative? China deliberately trapped Sri Lanka in unpayable debt to seize a strategic port near crucial Indian Ocean shipping lanes. What actually happened is more nuanced. In the early 2000s, Sri Lanka was emerging from a brutal civil war. The government, led by President Mahinda Rajapaksa, wanted to develop his hometown region of Hambantota, a politically motivated vanity project. Multiple Western institutions, including the World Bank, declined to fund it. Why? Because the business case was terrible. Hambantota is far from major shipping routes, and feasibility studies showed it would likely fail. China said yes. Between 2007 and 2017, China loaned Sri Lanka over $1.4 billion to build the port. But here's what the headlines often miss. Reality check 1. The port only accounts for about 5% of Sri Lanka's total debt. Their biggest creditors are actually international markets, 39%, and the Asian Development Bank, 13%. Reality check 2. Sri Lanka's debt crisis was caused by multiple factors. Massive tax cuts in 2019, costing $1.4 billion annually. The 2019 Easter bombings, devastating tourism. The COVID-19 pandemic. Economic mismanagement across the board. Reality check 3. The port deal wasn't a seizure. Sri Lanka voluntarily agreed to lease the port to a Chinese company for 99 years in exchange for $1.1 billion. Money they desperately needed. Sri Lanka maintained sovereignty. China got operational rights. Is this predatory lending? Maybe. Is it uniquely evil? Well, historical context. Britain leased Hong Kong from China for 99 years after the Opium Wars. The US operates Guantanamo Bay on a perpetual lease from Cuba. France still controls ports in several African nations. The difference? When Western powers did it, we called it strategic partnerships. When China does it, we call it a debt trap. Let's look at the data. not the propaganda. A 2019 study by the Center for Global Development identified 23 countries facing debt sustainability issues from BRI projects. But here's what's surprising. The actual numbers. Of 68 BRI countries studied, only 8 faced potential debt distress primarily from Chinese loans. Most heavily indebted BRI countries owe more to Western institutions and bond markets than to China. China has actually restructured or forgiven debt in 140-plus cases since 2000. Case study, Pakistan. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, CPEC, is worth $62 billion. Critics call it a debt trap, but Pakistan's largest creditor is actually the IMF, not China. CPEC represents about 10% of Pakistan's total external debt. The projects include critical infrastructure, highways, power plants that added 10,000 megawatts to the grid, reducing blackouts. Case study, Kenya. The standard gauge railway cost $3.6 billion in Chinese loans. Critics said it would bankrupt Kenya. Reality? The railway operates at a loss. True, but it cut travel time between Nairobi and Mombasa from 12 hours to 4 hours. It's created thousands of jobs. Kenya's debt distress is more related to domestic borrowing, 54% of debt, than Chinese loans, 21%. Case study, Zambia. Zambia defaulted on its debt in 2020. Headlines blamed China. The truth? Private bondholders, mostly Western, held 31% of Zambia's debt. China held 17%. Eurobonds and other commercial loans were actually the bigger problem. But guess who got blamed? Here's the pattern. When a country faces debt issues, China gets blamed for everything, even when they're a minority creditor. Before we paint China as the villain, let's talk about the alternative, Western-led development. The IMF and World Bank model. For decades, developing countries have borrowed from Western institutions. The conditions? Structural adjustment programs, SAPs. Cut government spending, often healthcare and education. Privatize state-owned enterprises. Reduce trade barriers. Prioritize debt repayment over social spending. Real consequences? In the 1980s and 90s, African countries following SAPs saw per capita income decline. Poverty increased in 77% of countries under structural adjustment. Public services collapsed as governments cut spending. Example, Greece, 2010 to 2018. The EU and IMF rescued Greece with bailout loans. The conditions? Slash pensions by 40%. Cut public sector wages by 20%. Sell off state assets, ports, airports, utilities. Unemployment hit 27%. Youth unemployment hit 60%. Sound familiar? When Europe does this to Greece, it's called fiscal responsibility. When China takes a port lease, it's a debt trap. Example, African nations. Western mining companies have extracted trillions in resources from Africa. In return, local communities often see no benefits. Environmental destruction is common. Profits flow back to Western capitals. Former colonial powers still control monetary policy in 14 African nations through the CFA franc. China's approach is different. They actually build infrastructure. Projects are usually completed. Western projects often stall. No political conditions attached. No demands for democracy, human rights reforms, etc. Technology and skills transfer, though limited. Is China's model perfect? Absolutely not. But is it worse than the alternative many countries have experienced? That's debatable. Here's what most analysis misses. China isn't trying to trap countries in debt. They're playing a much longer, more sophisticated game. China's actual objectives. 1. Secure resources and markets. China needs energy, minerals, and food for 1.4 billion people. BRI creates reliable supply chains. Projects often include agreements for resource access. 2. Export surplus capacity. China has overcapacity in steel, cement, construction. BRI keeps Chinese companies employed. It's domestic economic policy as much as foreign policy. 3. Internationalize the yuan. More BRI loans are denominated in yuan. This reduces China's dependence on the US dollar. Long-term play for yuan as global reserve currency. 4. Create diplomatic alliances. BRI countries often side with China in UN votes. It counters US influence without military force. Soft power through economic ties. 5. Establish strategic presence. Ports in Pakistan, Djibouti, Sri Lanka create a string of pearls around India. This is about geopolitical positioning, not debt collection. The evidence? When countries can't repay, China usually doesn't seize assets. They restructure the debt, extend terms, reduce interest, convert loans to grants, accept partial repayment, write off debt entirely. Why? Because China's reputation matters. If they're seen as predatory, countries will turn to other options. China needs willing partners, not resentful debtors. Data point: of 140-plus debt renegotiations China has done, only a handful involved asset seizures. Compare this to Western banks foreclosing on homes during the 2008 crisis. Now, let's be clear. China's model has real problems. 1. Lack of transparency. BRI loan terms are often secret. No public competitive bidding. Corruption concerns are legitimate. Local communities often aren't consulted. 2. Environmental damage. Many projects ignore environmental assessments. Coal plants in countries trying to go green. Deforestation. Habitat destruction. China's environmental standards abroad lag behind home. 3. Labor practices. Projects primarily use Chinese workers. Limited technology transfer. Local workers often get low-skilled jobs. This undermines the development narrative. 4. Geopolitical leverage. China does use debt for political pressure. Countries with Chinese loans vote with China 90% of the time in UN. This isn't altruism, it's strategic positioning. 5. Debt sustainability issues. Some projects are genuinely unviable. Feasibility studies are often weak. Host countries sometimes lack capacity to manage the rising power using economic statecraft, just like every great power before them. The question isn't whether China's approach is good or bad. The question is, what kind of global financial system do we want? One dominated by Western institutions with political conditions? One led by China with strategic strings attached? Or something entirely new? Because right now, we're watching that battle play out. One port, one railway, one power plant at a time. And the countries receiving these loans, they're not passive victims. They're making calculated decisions, weighing risks and benefits, and trying to develop their nations however they can. The real trap might not be the debt. It might be thinking there are simple answers to complicated questions.